think faith is and science are on parallel paths, and the two should never meet. And faith is, some people might say, is belief in something without evidence. That seems to be more of like a popular thing. If you ask someone, do you believe in God? They're like, no, I believe in science. I don't believe in God. So already you have these two, the false dichotomy presented. So either I have to believe in faith, or believe in God, or believe in science. So it seems to be like one of the most more popular debates in our culture today, especially with younger people in the universities. I know that that's a personal thing that I have to go through, being a science major and having many atheist professors who, in their science classes, talked about things like that, that's outside of their realm. And the reason why it's a cross is it's symbolic of a struggle that we might all have to go through in explaining our faith to other people, or just, understanding it better. Because some of this stuff can be painful to go through. Like there's all these theories and things in science that are just so amazing, and we don't know how to really engage in it. But apologetics is a good way to intersect all of them, to just have a better understanding of how the two can be compatible with each other. So really, what's the matter? Like, you can look at it both ways. Is the conflict really that the way we view the physical, the material world, and there's a problem, there's a conflict of interest between faith and a problem with just the mechanical and the molecular level of how the world works? Or is there something a little bit deeper than that? Like, is it more of a philosophical thing that we need to unpack a little bit? So this is the take-home message for tonight, is that the alleged conflict between faith and science is fueled by a combination of false assumptions, shallow theology, and a lack of proper dialogue within our own community. So that's the take-home message, and I think something we should talk about more and more, and actually learn about our Orthodox theology and get deeper into it, because some of it actually differs from the popular Western theology, and it might impact our view of how we view nature and reality, and in relationship with Christ and in the incarnation. So this is why this is the take-home message. And it's an alleged conflict because it's really superficial conflict. And I don't think that it's a conflict between science and faith. It's a conflict between science and something called the religion of naturalism, to be more specific. So apologetics is a good way to bridge the gap between the two. Has anybody ever heard of apologetics before? Christian apologetics?
No one has ever heard of it?
Yes.
Okay, no one.
Okay. Oh, this is good. This is good. I'm glad I'm introducing something a little bit new. So Christian apologetics, the word apologetics is derived from the Greek word apologia, which is found in the New Testament, and it means to give a defense, to justify, or to give reasoning, provide reasoning for. So in 1 Peter 3:15, it says, always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and respect. So this is where the idea of apologetics comes from. And it's important to note that it says always, so we should always be ready to say, I believe in this because, and provide evidence, because our faith is evidence-based, it's based in reality. Christ did come to our earth, he did establish his church continues, and there's historical, and you can go through different kinds of reasoning and evidence. So this is the practice of Christian apologetics. And we see this all over the history of the church. And if you want a perfect example from the New Testament, you look at Paul in Acts 17, where he talks to the philosophers the Greek philosophers on Mars Hill, and he engages with their own philosophy, and he doesn't just ignore their philosophy and say, oh, you know what, like, you're just wrong, and our Christianity is right. They actually borrowed from the thinking, the science of the time. The church fathers were very educated in pagan Greek, and they knew the science of their day. They engaged with it. And one of the most influential schools of thought was the catechetical school of Alexandria, where a lot of the most brilliant church fathers and thinkers were learned from there, and they engaged in debates. And they did that in the form of apologetics. And I think that's something, I mean, I'm passionate about, and hopefully you guys can maybe read up and see that there's some real evidence for our faith. And there are two kinds of apologetics. First is positive apologetics, so you defend the truth of the gospel, but by giving positive evidence. For example, the resurrection, you can give the facts, the historical facts of the resurrection. But we're not going to really talk about that. Related to the topic of science and faith is the negative apologetics, which means refuting fallacious thinking. So that goes back to the activity you did earlier. It's identifying what is the person asking you, what is your friend telling you, what is his struggle, and just providing some reasoning and say, you know what, I think what you're saying is not really true. You're committing this fallacy. If someone makes a fallacy, he's said to call committing a fallacy. So with this negative apologetics, you realize that surrounding the topic of faith and science, this is the perceived image that you get from our culture, that science and religion are like just wanting to beat each other up, and there's people on the science side wanting to just really eliminate religion, and then there's people on the religion side who are saying, you know, scientists are arrogant, we don't need to listen to what they're saying, and let's try to debunk things that science say. And usually we get, with this fallacy, it's a false dichotomy. So it makes you think like, oh, I have to pick between either religion or science. And you get different historical examples thrown at you in high school or college or wherever. And these historical things are, for example, the earth. People with religious convictions believed and taught that the earth was flat. But then modern science came and said, well, it's not, it's round. Therefore, you know, your religion is false. Look at your books. You should abandon these convictions. Did everyone learn that this is true? That people believe that the earth was flat? What do you think? Did people believe that the earth was flat? And Christopher Columbus came and he discovered that it was round? Yeah? Well, actually, that turns out to be historically false. People of ancient times did not believe that the earth was flat. And actually, the ancient Greeks calculated the circumference of the earth. And this, it's called the flat earth myth. You can look it up online later. But it was propagated during the 17th century and on. And this was part of making religion seem very barbaric and very uncivilized and anti-intelligence, to promote an idea that you may have learned in school, that religious people are idiotic. Okay? Another example you get is Copernicus and Galileo. This is one of people's favorite examples, to say, Copernicus and Galileo proved that the earth is no longer in the center of the universe, and the sun was. The earth actually rotates around. The Catholic Church heard this and, you know, went ballistic and said, no, you can't remove the earth from the center because we are God's creation. We're so special. You can't move us. So did everybody hear this also in like high school? Yeah, okay, you're excited about that response. Well, like, I mean, I think most of us did learn that. And there's some truth to that, except the actual problem at that time was not science and religion. It was mostly science and science. At the time, the science of their day was based on Aristotle and their philosophy. So the church, the Catholic Church, was kind of going along with the science of their day, that they had believed for hundreds of years, that the earth was at the center. I mean, it makes sense. You go outside, you look, the sun is there, the stars are there, things fall to the ground. I mean, you would think that the earth is at the center of the universe. It's just common sense knowledge. And actually, the scientific peers of Galileo at the time, when they tried him, they didn't believe him because of his lack of evidence. And also, at the time, they didn't believe that the earth had to be the center of the universe because humans were special. Actually, they believed the opposite. The philosophy of their day believed that the earth was the garbage dump, that dirty things fall to the ground. And it was just, we would not want to be in the center of the universe because that meant that somehow we were special, that somehow our physical world is special. And this is where you get some of the Platonic views that body, matter is bad, spirit is good. And actually you find this historically now, unfortunately some Western Christians have adopted this view that really the body and the world is bad, spirit is good. I can't wait to die so my spirit can just be released from my corrupt body. That kind of reasoning. So I'm sharing these myths because they have kind of propagated and made their way into academics. And I think they really influenced me because I'm like, sheesh, really, religion got it wrong all these many times. And there's the conflict thesis that you can also maybe do some study on it later on. But these two people, John William Draper and Andrew Dixon White, really wanted to influence American culture in the 19th century to create a warfare between Christianity and science. And interesting thing about White is that he was the first president and founder of Cornell University, which is the only Ivy League to be established without a seminary. Other Ivy Leagues were established with seminaries because that was one of their main missions, is to teach, about God. So they kind of promoted this idea that Christianity, mainly Roman Catholicism, was at war with science. And this has been adopted by a lot of Protestant Christians throughout history because of the attacks against papal infallibility and things that the Catholic Church did wrong at that time. Because, there was some corruption going on in Europe. So they over-exaggerated things like the flat earth myth and the issues with Galileo, and even misquoted and misrepresented people like St. Basil the Great and John Chrysostom in their writings. So they took things out of context and kind of exaggerated them. But also, in addition to that, people now think that not only is there a warfare between science and religion, but actually religion is just really bad because it's just the cause of wars and violence and death in the world, so we should just get rid of it and move on to a more scientific worldview, so that way we can really deal rationally with the world. And you'll hear this all the time. Can anybody guess what this number is?
People who were killed for religious reasons.
Anybody? History person? Okay. Actually, this is the number of people in the 20th century alone that were killed under atheistic regimes that were promoting a scientific worldview in less than 75 years. And you're like, wow, okay, so I thought religion was the bad guy. And I'm not picking on people or certain regimes. but this is the reality, this is the history, is when people say, well, religion is just bad. Well, the 20th century was the bloodiest century in all of human history. This is when people promoted social Darwinism, they promoted a scientific worldview, and where they thought they were progressing. So this is a way to evolve our intellectual humanity by cleansing, ethnic cleansing. By 1941, only 500 out of 54,000 churches existed in Soviet Russia, in the Soviet Union. Only 500 out of 54,000. That's a big deal. They imprisoned a lot of the priests, the lay people in the gulags. So does this surprise anybody?
So this is in the last, how long, sorry?
This is in the 20th century, so it would be like 1917 to 1986, something like that.
So do you have the numbers for how many people were killed for differences in religions? So
No, because it would be scattered. Like you can look at the Inquisition, for example, and there are various Inquisitions in European history, or you can look at the 30-year war between the Catholics and the Protestants, for example. But I don't know, the number does not compare. I mean, 100 million deaths doesn't even compose the 85 million to 90 million additional people that died during that century under Nazi Germany and other, like World War I and II and all that kind of stuff. That excludes the wars that existed at that time. But I don't have like a number specifically about religion. I mean, you can look that up. But this is the bloodiest century on record, and it was promoted by an atheistic, science-driven worldview. But that's not the main point. I mean, people will say, and the reason I'm presenting to you, because I want you to be aware of like all the deep like criticisms of Christianity mainly that is out there, so you're aware that people do say these kinds of things. Richard Dawkins, who's the world's most famous atheist, it's an honor, I guess, he says, science has eradicated smallpox, can immune against most previously deadly viruses, can kill most previously deadly bacteria. Theology has done nothing but talk of pestilence as the wages of sin. So theology has done nothing. I mean, we would say, of course science has done all these things, but what does that have to do with, why are you attacking theology? It was Christians who founded hospitals and who created science, and I'm going to go into that in a little bit, but what was I going to say? There's a point that I don't want to forget. Oh, St. Basil the Great. Right, that's my point. He actually created hospitals and hospice centers, whatever you want to call it, and centers for the poor. And at that time, they called it Wonders of the World, because he actually went around creating hospitals for people. And I mean, look at all the hospitals that are created by Christians. I mean, you can't criticize that much. But anyway, what is the third leading cause of death in the U.S.? Anybody want to guess?
Heart disease.
You would think. Heart disease is number 1. Number 2 is cancer. Number 3 is...
Auto accidents.
No. Errors. It's obviously related to the topic. It's errors. Sorry. It's
That's a good guess.
the errors from medical professionals like doctors. Actually, around 400,000 deaths occur per year because of errors in the method of practicing medicine. And it's according to you can look it up, Journal of Patient Safety in 2013, the article published that. And I was like, whoa, I only saw this a couple weeks ago. I was like, I have to include that because it just shows that it's not really, I'm not saying that to attack like science or medicine, but science is as good as a person is really. I mean, if a person is a bad scientist, they're gonna come out with bad results. So if a person is, you know, yes, science has provided cures for many things, but if a person is not using that ethically, and you know, you get the point, then it's going to lead to being the third leading cause of death. So to Richard Dawkins, he needs to check his facts because, I mean, it's not really theology that has ruined people. Medicine also, you know, unethical practice has led to that too. But anyway, so the critique is not against science. It's actually, science is birthed from Christianity. And mainly from the Judeo-Christian view that there is a God who organized and ordered everything. And this is why modern science was created. C.S. Lewis wrote, I love his quote, said, "Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver." Now, this is opposed to pagan Greeks at that time. They believed that when it rained, it was the rain god, or the sun shined because the god was happy, or they believed that nature was controlled at the whims of happy or angry gods. So they had really no concept of the kind of science or the laws and the organization. But it wasn't until Francis Bacon, who is the father of modern science, was a devout Christian who developed the scientific method. And many of the scientists have been Christians or theists. They believe in God. And that allowed them, that didn't make them, you know, say, oh, you know, we don't need God. We'll just do science. Actually, believing in God helped them to do their science because they believed that there is an ordered world that they could study. So the scope of science, science is the study of the natural world through experiment and observation. But the important thing to realize is that science can't see outside of itself. Science is not omniscient. It can't say that nature caused nature, or that reality ends here. That's a metaphysical, philosophical claim. And that's not testable, it's not, you can't observe it, you can't do experiments to say that even God caused science. So a person can't say, you know, according to science, God does not exist. Well, science doesn't study that. So if someone says that to you, you say, well, you're just using science as a cop-out or as a way to kind of deceive me, but science doesn't study that in the first place. This is a philosophical or theological claim. Let's discuss it some more. But there are main two philosophical things that underlie science or the scientific method. First is metaphysical naturalism. I know it sounds complicated, but basically it means that matter is the only thing in existence. Matter, that's it. And matter just assembles by itself, and you know, we have life and all that. It's equivalent to atheism, that God does not exist. So metaphysical naturalism is a philosophical statement that says matter is the only thing in reality. The second thing is methodological naturalism. And this is the philosophical assumption that all scientific endeavors are to be explained and tested by material causes and events. And this is okay. So something happens, science will do their thing, it's a material cause, material event. There are many Christians and theists who are scientists who follow that assumption. It helps them do their science. They're not invoking God did it. They're not using what people would say God of the gaps, like, oh, this sunrise looks so amazing. God must have done it or something. They will usually have more of a naturalistic explanation as part of their method. And that's okay. Has anybody ever heard of that distinction between metaphysical and methodological? No. Well, it's just helpful to know in general. I don't want to bore you.
Isn't that like pantheism?
No, this has nothing to do with...
That matter is all the first part, metaphysical, where matter is the only thing
Well, actually, I mean, it could, in a way. Well, pantheism believed that God is everything. But this even strips any kind of meaning or divinity from anything in existence. It just says it matter, just is. Like, that's all there is to reality. And this is actually important because it helps us in other, like, next week, everyone's going to talk a little bit about evolution. The following week, I'll talk a little bit about neuroscience and some assumptions about the brain and how people in the media can misuse scientific data to deceive people. But metaphysical naturalism is equal to atheism, and that's what's in conflict with science. So Carl Sagan, Cosmos, the famous quote, "The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be." And then, he gives the explanation of the universe, and, therefore, God does not exist. Or Dawkins, he says, "DNA never cares nor knows. DNA just is, and we dance to its music." That's one of his famous. So basically, it just matters. We're just molecules in motion, moving around, and we get a Joe and a Sandy and a Fanny and a Julie, and we just all are just dancing to our DNA because that's what matter does. It gets together randomly by billions and billions of years. Whatever, who knows when the next Big Bang is going to happen, and we're going to, be consumed back into this massive bubble. And so that's kind of the rationale you'll hear a lot. So that's the main issue. Like, that's the conflict number one that we should just be aware of when we hear debates or criticisms of faith and science. It's not really science. It's more of a belief. This is a faith in only matter. This is also something that needs to be examined. And I'll critique it in a little bit. The next conflict is scientism. So if something is not scientific, then I won't believe it. And I'm glad that most all of you said that not everything can be proved by science. So it also leads people to say, well, science can explain the order of the universe, therefore we don't need God. Science tells us how things work, maybe like what matter is composed of, how matter interacts with each other. It'll also tell us how humans interact with each other, and it ends up being like, so why do I love another person? Oh, it's because of evolution. Why do I go to school and have friends because of evolution? Why do I this? And everything is just, well, it's because of evolution. So why do I believe in God? Well, it's because of evolution. So everything, phenomenon that happens in life is going to lead back to just evolution or a scientific explanation to everything. And that's a problem because you can't, even the statement, everything has to be explained by science or I won't believe it, is self-defeating. Can you actually prove your own statement using science and observable evidence? So there are limits or examples of it in the media is you'll hear people say, scientists agree that blah, blah, blah. So everything like influential has to come from science. And a new study shows we can get you to believe anything as long as we say a new study shows before whatever we said. So people are really influenced by that. Or 9 out of 10 doctors agree. And it's like, yeah, what happened to the 10th person? Did he fall asleep on the job? Like, did he not respond to the survey? And it's like never like 7 out of 10 doctors or 5 out of 10 doctors. It's just ways to really popularize science. Science is very useful. I'm not like criticizing it. I'm just saying this translates into the popular media thinking that science is going to explain everything. One day we're going to know that for sure God does not exist. But, there are limits of science. There are things that we rationally accept that can't be proven by science. There are things that we actually believe in, we have faith in, that can't be subject to science. Does anybody have an example of what that could be?
Love.
Love. Well, it's hormone, you have some dopamine here and there. It's the brain. Doesn't that explain love?
Well, not
Anything
whole.
else?
Where the very first atom came from? Like science can't prove that, but we have to accept it rationally, we have no choice.
That there was a first Adam.
Like the very first molecule, like where did that come from? Like nobody can explain where that came from.
Yeah, so it's more of like a metaphysical thing, like how did things come into existence? That's right. You're right, my math is right. So science itself has unprovable assumptions. For example, the theory of relativity, there's the assumption that is unprovable that the constancy of light between point A and point B, well, there is constancy between point A and point B, whatever that means. I don't even know what that means. But anyway, trust me, I looked this up. It's an unprovable assumption. I mean, there are other things that like you just have to assume in order to do science. Like science itself is, you can't prove the scientific method or methods. There are several methods to science, but you can't like prove it because it's more of a philosophical thing. Like you can't put it in a test tube and be like, you know, does this look like a scientific method? So no, you can't observe it. You just assume that this is the ways of logic. So that gets assumed logical truths, such as the law of non-contradiction. Two things can't be true at the same time if they contradict each other. That's just something we know based on reality. Metaphysical truth, like the external world exists, or there is an external world and I can know it. That's something that is metaphysical. It's beyond just, you know, science. You have to assume that.
Like, how do you know you're not living in the Matrix?
Yeah, how do you know you're not in the Matrix? Like, you're being controlled by.
Exactly.
Aesthetical judgments, like things that are beautiful. You can't test beauty. I mean, you can do some geometric stuff, but it's not going to tell you the personal experience of beauty. Sorry. Moral judgments, like how you should act, what we should do, what we are here to do, what is the right or wrong thing to do. Science can't prove that or help with that. Question. So to illustrate this, suppose that scientists say, oh, actually I want you guys to do it. Suppose scientists said that all humans have a deep, innate desire to put bananas in their ears. There's some kind of like genetic thing going on, and all humans have a desire to put bananas in their ears. And I know this is like a really very silly example, but it relates. I don't want to get into like other topics right now, but it does relate to things that people might say. Like science proves that people have this X, Y, and Z, therefore people should do it. People should be free to do whatever they want. So how would you figure out that you do this? Should we do this?
Should we?
Yeah. You guys figure out, like, talk about it. Should we do it? Like, what would you want to ask?
Because science says so?
Yeah, I mean, this is a deep, there's proof, scientific evidence that we have an innate desire to put bananas in our ears. It makes us feel good.
Usually, okay. I was just gonna say, usually if something's innate, there's a purpose to it. You know, if it makes us feel good, I guess. You know.
Okay.
So,
What other questions would you want to know? Like, should we go around putting bananas in our ears? I know it's kind of stupid.
Like, if you're trying to decide, should I put a banana in my ear? What would you want to know?
well, it depends how far.
Like, science tells you that this is...
Or 9 out of 10 people doing it.
Oh, yeah, and yeah, science will tell you that statistically, I mean, it's a significant statistic, you know, the distribution, whatever, it shows that people will do it, and the frequency, like 5 times a day, people just want to do it.
So if you don't have it, are you not human? If you don't have this deep desire?
No,
Because it's innate, so I mean, like based on the statement, I would say yeah.
Do you mean like in a moral sense? How would I want to do it?
well, yeah, the question is, yeah, morally, would you want to do it? Socially, psychologically, like, would you want to ask, how would society respond to me if I do something like that?
I mean, if it's innate and everyone has it, society really wouldn't have a response. Everyone's doing it.
Is it going to damage my ear?
Well, science can prove that it might damage your ear, or it might not damage your ear. I mean, I think the point is not that it's innate, because we also have innate desires to punch people when we're angry sometimes. I mean, rage or anger, there are certain innate desires or things that we're genetically predisposed to. But I think the point of the example is like, if we should do something, is that a scientific question? If science says we have a desire to do something, does that mean we should do it? You would want to know more, like what are the implications of that? And that's an example of, a limit of science. Science can't really answer that. Does that make sense?
So science, you're essentially saying science can't dictate or explain why we do what we do, or why we should do what we do.
Yeah, ought. Like, should I do this? Should I be a good person today? Science, that's not a scientific question. That's more of a moral, philosophical, ethical question that we would need to talk about. You can use science to give you the facts, but doesn't mean that, you should do it. Anyway, let's move on. But what about people who say, well, Big Bang Theory shows us that, the universe just existed from particles that collided or whatever. So you heard about this Big Bang. And so there was nothing, and then that nothing exploded and gave us the universe. So therefore, God does not exist, or there's a problem because Christians or people like Christians, Muslims, and Jews believe that God created the world, the entire cosmos out of nothing. Christianity mainly believes that God created the world ex nihilo, out of nothing. And science says, well, there was a Big Bang, and there was inflation and cosmic.
But the thing is, what was there before the Big Bang?
Yeah.
Nothing. So it's essentially, they're explaining the how.
Right. Well, exactly. So the Big Bang is explanation of like the gun smoke, the smoking gun, but it's not the explanation of who shot the gun or where it's aiming at or what's the purpose behind it. It can tell you, yes, there is quantum particles, there's a quantum vacuum, the Higgs boson, the God particle that they call now. Like all these physics-related things, okay, that's fine, but we're talking about the actual existence. We believe that God created the entire universe. It's not like quantum physics created the universe. Or, like you explained it really well. This is how the early universe developed, but it's not why, or what's the purpose of it. What was before the Big Bang? Okay. But people will say, well, it's the laws of nature. Laws of nature will dictate that things will happen a certain way. And if particles are there, already existent, they will come together, and boom, you get a universe. And you say, okay, there's the laws of nature. Well, first you have to explain where do we get the laws of nature from. So what is the laws of nature? They just exist on their own? Because that's a metaphysical question too. It's not a scientific question of where did the laws of nature come from. And so it's kind of like saying that we no longer need Mozart to explain his piano concerto number 21 because we can explain it using the laws of music and laws of notation. We can see the music, how music works, bass clef, triple clef, all the laws of music that are universal, right? Aren't there laws of music?
Yeah.
Music teacher?
Music theory.
Music theory, yeah, the laws of music theory. Things actually work, sound frequencies and scales, and it's really cool. But so does that mean that we don't need Mozart anymore? Like an intelligent person who actually created this with a purpose, you would want to ask who created it. You wouldn't assume, oh, it just assembled itself randomly and just give us this ensemble of amazing music. How much more is the universe with all its intricacies and fine-tuning? I like this quote by John Lennox. He's a mathematician at the University of Oxford and a Christian apologist. You can look him up. His name is John Lennox. He says, the internal combustion engine is arguably more relevant than Henry Ford to the question of how a car works, but not for why it exists in the first place. So you can talk about car engines and how it works and all you want without mentioning Henry Ford, But if you want to talk about why it even exists, you're going to have to kind of say, okay, well, this guy named Henry Ford, he kind of helped develop this whole thing. But anyway, the last conflict, and then we're done, is the either-or logic. So either you believe in Christianity and you have faith in Christ, or you believe in science and what science has to teach. You know, you can't really rationally accept both. And this is, again, the false dichotomy. And we have to look at both, really, especially as Orthodox Christians or from an Orthodox standpoint, because we believe that the Word, the Logos, became flesh. The uncreated Creator actually took on material reality. He became a body with veins and arteries and blood rushing and a brain and a mind and all that it means to be a material person. And he united himself with us. So yeah, we can study anatomy, we can study science, how things work. But that doesn't mean that that's all there is to a person, or that's all there is to reality. When we say that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, we're saying that there's something actually important and valuable about matter, that God would want to unite himself to the creation through human beings, and that we can understand this and we can comprehend this. And that's something that is way outside the realm of science. It's getting into revelation and what God has chosen to reveal and to do in creation. And this is actually, the Orthodox Church is a perfect example of how we view matter as good. Think about the sacraments. I mean, technically we view everything as sacramental, because even that God created everything out of nothing is like a mystery. We can't comprehend it. It's a mystery. But like the sacraments of the church, baptism, okay, how does that renew me? How am I given a new birth through baptism? Or the chrismation, or the oil, the maroon when you're chrismated. Material things are actually very useful, and they have special meaning in our lives. For example, the Eucharist, the bread and the wine, we also believe that they are the body and the blood of Christ, but we also still believe that they're still the body, the bread and wine. We don't say that they're no longer physical realities. We accept them as both. So we view things, we have to look at things in both ways, and appreciate science for what it describes to us, and also give it the meaning that it deserves, that God intended it to be. And we say that the material things that we have point us to, when properly understood and given their proper meaning, they have their true purpose and reality in life. So the church is the body of Christ. It's also the church, and it's the body of Christ, but it's actually the body of Christ. Like how? So we shouldn't think of compartmentalizing things and saying, well, this is science, this is religion, this is... No, we have to view things as a whole, and in its proper part. Oh, hey, I forgot you there, sorry. But also an example of, in our church, we have icons. And if you go to many, and I'm not picking up on like any specific church group, but a lot of, just to show the example of how later on in Western Christianity, matter was viewed as kind of bad. Icons were no longer allowed in most Protestant churches. You might have a cross if you're lucky enough, you'll get a cross. And actually, when I came in today, I saw this like aluminum or like metal cross. I'm like, that's a perfect example. It's not even a wooden cross. I guess it's a modern cross. But there was a lot of debate and criticism in Western Christianity between having icons or no icons. And people said, no, that's idolatry. We don't matter. We don't need matter. It's just a personal relationship between me and God. We don't need that. But we're like, but God became flesh. The Word became, like, if He was there, you could take a picture of Him, and you could send it out to people, and you could frame it in your house. So it's the idea that matter is bad, spiritual is good. That's not Orthodox Christianity. That's why we have to view everything as a whole, together. So another example, if you go out at night and you look at like a starry night and you're walking with maybe a significant other or someone you want to impress, and you say, it's funny because Joe and I, our wedding theme was a starry night, and like imagine if he was like so scientifically driven and he was saying, and I said, oh look at Joe, look at the stars, they're beautiful, like they're kind of like singing out to us, and he said, you're an idiot, these are fiery balls of fiery hot gas that are just made up of helium and hydrogen. And I'm like, but they're shining. And he's like, no, it's not shining. What are you talking about? All it is hydrogen colliding into helium and at the core, and that's what you see. I'm like, you're crazy. Like, peace out. We're not getting married. You wouldn't be able to functionally like live. You wouldn't be able to really live or have any kind of coherence in reality if you just view things in one way, in a mechanical, molecular, everything has to point to a molecular or some kind of purpose. There is, as human beings, we have a mind and we can reason and we can view purpose and meaning and beauty and logic and philosophy and metaphysics and all that kind of awesome stuff. And that's awesome. Anyway, so this is like the final quote that I'm going to share. David Berlinsky, I think this is one of the most important quotes. It recaps everything. You can look this quote up if you want to read up on it more, because it's a little hard to understand at first. And he says, he's by the way an analytical philosopher at, he taught at Princeton University, at other places, MIT maybe, I'm not really sure, but you can look him up. He says, has anyone provided a proof of God's inexistence? Not even close. Has quantum cosmology explained the emergence of the universe or why it is here? Not even close. Have the sciences explained why our universe seems to be fine-tuned to allow for the existence of life? Not even close. Are physicists and biologists willing to believe in anything so long as it is not religious thought? Close enough. Has rationalism in moral thought provided us with an understanding of what is good, what is right, and what is moral? Not close enough. Has secularism in the terrible 20th century been a force for good? Not even close to being close. Is there a narrow and oppressive orthodoxy of thought and opinion within the sciences? Close enough. Does anything in the sciences or in their philosophy justify the claim that religious belief is irrational? Not even ballpark. Is scientific atheism a frivolous exercise in intellectual contempt? Dead on. So that kind of like recaps the entire talk, discussion talk, because he goes through it like the 20th century and a lot of things that you can refer back to. But the last point he made is scientific atheism a frivolous exercise in intellectual contempt? Scientific atheism is the same thing as metaphysical naturalism, the philosophical belief that only matter exists, and that leads to atheists like Richard Dawkins making fun of religious believers. And I mean, he says it, you can look him up on YouTube, him and his, the four
horsemen of the new atheism.
Four horsemen, they're known as the four horsemen of the new atheism. They actually promote ridiculing and making fun of Christians especially. Like they will go and say, we no longer need to reason with these people, let's just make fun of them and ridicule them for just having faith. But it's like, let's engage in dialogue. That's kind of like an ad hominem attack, you're not really getting into the truth. So let's have a coherent discussion. So we don't need to choose between the light from electricity and the light of the resurrection. Both are necessary for us as human beings. We can look at it both ways. In Romans 1:20, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. And really the whole letter to the Romans is, you can read it, I mean, it's amazing because Paul does talk to a lot of the Greek who were once pagans, or even atheists. A lot. Like, I think the letter to the Romans is a good way to kind of recap this in a more biblical sense.